Thank you, Joel. Thank you very much. Good to see many of you and old friends. I'm a huge fan of the work of the Institute, as Joel mentioned, and the valuable, important theological lay education that you're constantly providing for those of us who are very busy in Washington, D.C. The importance could not be any greater than it is now, not only among lay people here in Virginia and Washington, and not only among the media, but also among even our politicians. You may not have heard the story. About 6 years ago, two senators were having lunch in the Senate dining room, one a Democrat and one a Republican, and this was back in '08. And the Republican said to the Democrat, you know, the problem with you Democrats is that you don't understand religion. You don't know any religious doctrine. You don't really even, all the survey data tells us that you're becoming more and more a secular party, and you don't even know any religious people. In fact, I bet you $20 right now, you can't even recite the Lord's Prayer. And the Democratic candidate said, oh, I can do that. And he closed his eyes and he said, now I lay me down to sleep. Whereupon the Republican reached in his pocket, pulled out $20 and said, I didn't think you could do it. So the urgency of the good work of the Institute in helping educate lay and political leaders and everybody across society could not be more important. Now, I work at a think tank, so I'm working from a text. I know this is being live Skyped, and one of your colleagues wanted to know if I would prance around and move around a lot. I said, no, I'm going to be in one place. I'll be right here, looking at that camera. Our topic today is faithful living in challenging times, and it's been a concern from the very beginning of time. It is not a new concern. As Adam said to Eve when they were walking out of the garden, we live, my dear, in a time of great transition. But it is unique to our time. Many respected theologians and social scientists have observed that we are living in a new time of significant transition in our culture and society. You may ask how so, and I would like to suggest the following. It's simply the case that the public square in Western society is no longer a place where people of Orthodox Christian faith can feel they belong with any degree of ease or comfort. We live in a culture where ordinary moral reflection and conversation about human sexuality and traditional marriage is seen as a form of bigotry, and in some places it's seen as a hate crime. Any position other than the currently politically correct position on same-sex marriage is now met with surprise and disgust by almost everyone in our elite culture, as if we were trying to defend chattel slavery or something. Many of us who are defenders of the Orthodox Christian faith are seen by those in our elite culture as curious strangers who are apparently speaking literally a foreign language. I do not think it's melodramatic for me to say that our sincere beliefs and firm convictions as Christians is rapidly leading us into cultural exile and moving us to the margins of American public life. But is this really all that new now? Have we not seen these rapid changes in our culture coming for several decades now? I would like to suggest we have. Over 20 years ago, a very important book came out by a sociologist at the University of Virginia named James Davison Hunter. He wrote a book called Culture Wars. In it, Hunter argued that we are in the midst of a cultural conflict between essentially two sectors in our society: those who hold to traditional Judeo-Christian moral values and those who adhere to a more liberal and progressive view of moral values and religious faith. Hunter argued that our culture wars were a result of what, and I quote, the result of political and social hostility rooted in different systems of moral understanding. These involved, he said, opposing bases of moral authority and the worldviews that derived from them. Hunter suggested these two groups were simply worlds apart, utterly worlds apart, in the way they saw not only moral issues, but all of life. Now, as people who hold totally different worldviews, they engaged in what he called moralities in conflict. Moralities in conflict, as evidenced by what he then described as a genuine culture war. Hunter went on to say that the Orthodox worldview on one side and the progressive worldview on the other side was like this. The Orthodox believed that ultimate moral authority is external, it's definable, and it's transcendent. For progressives, the binding moral authority tends to reside in personal experience or in scientific rationality. So as Professor Hunter explained, members of Orthodox America appealed to definable authority, while the progressive worldview relied on conversations in which various multiple sources of authority would have their say without having any final word. This progressive counterculture worldview and project then was not to establish a new set of norms to replace the old norms, but instead sought to create a society where people get along with as few rules as possible. Few rules as possible. Now, Hunter's book made a big splash, and he got a lot of reviews in the academic and the popular press. And a man I was privileged to get to know in Washington many, many years ago was the late Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol was a widely respected Jewish public intellectual who was held in high esteem by people on the right and the left in Washington and in New York elite circles for his astute opinions and observations. Having just finished reading James Hunter's book, I was attending a conference at the American Enterprise Institute where Irving Kristol was the keynote speaker. And this was over 20 years ago. After he finished in the casual Q&A around the podium, I went up to Kristol and I said, so Irving, what do you think about this book by James Hunter? And we're in the middle of a culture war. I'll never forget what he said. He looked at me and said, Michael, there's not a culture war in America today. There was one, but it's over. And the other side won. I said, what? He said, yeah, it happened, and it's over. They won. Well, that really set me aback, as you can imagine. The other side had won? This was 20 years ago. So I was a bit taken aback, and he was echoing the views of his eminent historian wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, who wrote an important book a few years later after that called One Nation, but Two Cultures. One Nation, Two Cultures, where Himmelfarb said America's confronting at least 6 challenges. Number 1, the collapse of ethical principles and habits. Number 2, the loss of respect for authority and institutions. Number 3, the breakdown of the family. Number 4, the decline of civility. Number 5, the vulgarization of high culture. And number 6, the degradation of popular culture. She said, this is what's happening in America. The collapse of ethical principles and habits, the loss of respect for authorities and institutions, the breakdown of the family, the decline of civility, the vulgarization of high culture, and the degradation of popular culture. She happened to be the wife of Irving Kristol. Now, the Kristols were very wise observers, and what they suggested is that many of the cultural trends we lament today were set in motion a very long time ago. But I suspect there's even a deeper dimension to be explored here, especially if we are to understand these challenges properly as Christians. Perhaps our mistake is in assuming that we ever had the culture in the first place, that we ever had it to lose in the first place. Perhaps we misunderstand the relationship of Christian faith to our culture when we do this. But before I suggest to you what our response should be, let me just call your attention to a response right now that's getting a lot of attention in the popular press. A growing number of Christian scholars and leaders are concerned that America in 2015 is beginning to look like a declining empire. The prolific writer and blogger Rod Dreher, who spoke recently in Washington on Capitol Hill at the Faith and Law group, and then he spoke at Georgetown the next day. Rod is prolific. Has introduced an approach to culture that he commends for Christians in these dark days. He calls it the Benedict option. It's been receiving a lot of attention lately, and Saint Benedict was a 5th century Roman saint and monk who was born around 400 AD in Nursia, Italy. He lived at a time during the rise of Christian monasticism, which encouraged believers to leave one's communal life in society for a monastic life in the desert, usually living in small community clusters led by abbots. Now, when Benedict left Nursia and went to Rome, he found the city to be deeply degenerate and full of vice. So he was repelled by this, and he retreated to the mountains. He became a monk, he led a monastery, and eventually he wrote what were called the Benedict Rules, which was a 73-chapter handbook on prayer and work that led to the founding of the Order of St. Benedict, which became a group of monastic communities. Now, what does Rod Dreher mean when he calls us Christians to consider the Benedict option? Here's what he says, and I'm quoting, "The Benedict option refers to Christians in the contemporary West who cease to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of the American empire, and who therefore are keen to construct local forms of community as the loci of Christian resistance against what the empire represents. Put grandly, the Benedict option is an umbrella term for Christians to recognize that forming Christians who live out Christianity according to the great tradition requires embedding them within communities and institutions dedicated to their Christian formation." That's end of quote. Now, Rod Dreher is reminding us that we live in a culture full of moral chaos and fragmentation, in which many important questions are simply impossible to settle. He's been deeply influenced by the eminent philosopher Alistair McIntyre, who argues that we live in very dark times and that finding our way back to the straight paths will require establishing new forms of community that have as their ends the life of Christian virtue. Now, Dreher says we are going to have to change the way we practice our faith and teach it to our children and to build more resilient communities. Again, why is he saying this? He says this: "Some of us will live to see the day when Orthodox Christians will be considered exotic antiques at best, and threats to decency at worst, potentially harmful individuals who must be driven out of public life." End of quote. He says he's not endorsing quietism or total withdrawal, but simply trying to give us a realistic understanding of where we are and where we stand as Christians in the 21st century. Again, why is he suggesting this? It should be obvious to all of us. The moral decadence of so much of our contemporary society clearly seems to indicate the waning influence of Christian faith on American culture. So Rod Dreher is suggesting it is time to regroup. It's time to immerse ourselves in communities that share our values, to develop more robust theologies and become a beacon and light in the dark shadows of our culture. The great church historian and patristic scholar Robert Louis Wilkin put it this way. He said, "Nothing is more needful today than the survival of Christian culture, because in recent generations this culture has become dangerously thin. At this moment in the church history in this country, it is less urgent to convince the alternative culture in which we live the truth of Christ than it is for the church to tell itself its own story and to nurture its own life. This is not going to happen without a rebirth of moral and spiritual discipline and a resolute effort on the part of Christians to comprehend and defend the remnants of Christian culture." And then concluding Wilkins' quote, "The unhappy fact is the society in which we live today is no longer neutral about Christianity." No longer neutral. Put simply, Christians in today's society no longer are the moral majority, but we're now the moral minority. Some of the important questions we must ask ourselves are these: what must we as Christians do in order to live faithfully as a minority in a culture in which we were once considered the majority? As for me, I have great respect for Rod Dreher, and I concur with his plea that we need to develop strong Christian communities rooted in deep discipleship. But I feel that this need not be an either-or proposition. My concern is that those who follow the Benedict option will create sealed-off Christian communities and may well find themselves sealed off from having any influence in the world of the media, in the world of the arts, in the worlds of science, in the worlds of literature, and yes, even in the world of politics. In other words, being sealed off in crucial areas shaped by meaningful public influence and conversation. There is certainly room for lament when looking at the condition of the modern world, but the ability of the church to offer its prophetic voice to the culture would be definitely weakened if we went for the Benedict option. For me, the best guide for rethinking our relationship to society and culture in these challenging contemporary times is St. Augustine. Indeed, I think I should call it the Augustinian option. I want to argue that what we need is an Augustinian sensibility, which I'll explain in a moment. An Augustinian sensibility if we are to rightly discern what we as Christians should and should not do and aspire to do in our private and public witness. In his classic book, In the City of God, Augustine makes a very radical claim. He says that the city of man, meaning the world and this culture, is always at odds with the city of God. Because we presently live between the two cities, We can never really ever claim to have won the culture. Never. We live at the intersection of the ages. That understanding, that commitment to a future city of God should always be operating in the back of our minds as we seek to be faithful citizens in this very broken world, doing the best we can with the broken instruments that we have at our disposal. This does not mean that we cease to love and care for this earthly city or for the welfare of our fellow image bearers. But I am suggesting that this Augustinian view, this Augustinian sensibility, will give us a more realistic approach to the challenges we face in our culture and our various vocations and our callings. This Augustinian sensibility will keep us realistic about our goals and our expectations, and will keep us from having the mentality of an embattled minority, a pattern that has been prevalent among some of our fellow brethren in the recent past. So what are we to be doing now in light of this Augustinian sensibility? Well, Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7 says this: "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." So we're to do what we've always been commanded to do: build houses, raise family, plant gardens, produce good art, produce good music and good culture. We're to seek justice and to love mercy and to care for the least of these and to love our neighbors. One important form of neighbor love is to treat everyone, friends and foes alike, no matter what their status or their station in life, with respect and dignity as we go about our daily lives and our vocations. One of the most important intellectual mentors in my life was the late Richard John Newhouse. Newhouse once said this so well. He said, "It is our duty to strive to build a world in which the strong are just and power is tempered by mercy, in which the weak are nurtured and the marginal embraced, and to see it that those at the entrance gates and those at the exit gates of life are protected both by law and by love." Let me repeat that for you. Newhouse says, "It is our duty to strive to build a world in which the strong are just, power is tempered by mercy, in which the weak are nurtured and the marginal are embraced, and those at the entrance gates and those at the exit gates of life are protected both by law and by love." That's a beautiful description of our calling. As the text in Jeremiah suggests, we do live in a time of exile. As Christians, we are, according to Augustine, we are a people out of place. This is not our home. In this brief life, short of the promised kingdom of God, we are resident alien citizens. As resident aliens, we are commanded by the Apostle Paul in Romans 12:2 to not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. This is why it is so important, the work that C.S. Lewis Institute does. It promotes the renewing of mind so that we might rightly discern the will of God and know what is good and true and beautiful in the sight of God. For many of us who lead busy lives in our work, the opportunity to keep growing spiritually and theologically through the Institute's lay theological programs is really, really vital. We need to stay constantly on the growing edge as Christian believers, and living in exile demands that we have a clear identity concerning who we are as Christians. To retain our identities, we need to be a part of a vibrant community of lifelong learners who know what we believe and why we believe it. And so the Institute fulfills Flannery O'Connor's famous dictum that we need institutions that push back as hard against the world as the world pushes against us. Push back as hard against the world as the world pushes against us. So the Institute prepares us to be strong and to be faithful when we are confronted by the hostile worldviews and the false gospels of this world. And as we live and move and have our being in the contemporary world, we need to have confidence in our identities and in our destinies as Christians. As my friend Russell Moore of the Southern Baptist Convention has recently put it, he says, and I quote, "Our views will be more and more to come to be seen as strange and freakish. in this kind of culture will be seen as strange and freakish in this current culture. Hence our need to be clear, crystal clear, about what we believe and why we believe it. Again, this is another reason why the work of the Institute is so important. Instead of complaining about the culture, we need to continually work to get our own lives and our own communities in order. Part of the Benedict option. Let's get our own lives, be the church. Hence the need for your good endeavors to show forth the beauty of the good news of the gospel in an age that so desperately needs to hear really good news. So having an Augustinian sensibility will give us a spiritual and emotional balance as we remind ourselves we now live at the intersection of the ages, between the city of man and the city of God that is to come. Living our lives at the intersection of the city of God and the city of man means that we develop what one great sociologist calls an aesthetic for the interim. Let me repeat. Develop what he calls an aesthetic for the interim, the in-between times. This is a way of looking at life with an awareness that we are living between the times. Therefore, we are encouraged to exercise patience and to put a ban on all ostentation and triumphalism. In these kinds of times, I believe it is vitally important to remind ourselves of the importance of civility in our public discourse and our presentations with the wider culture. Now, here I'm concerned with our tone of voice when we write and speak in public. What we say in public matters. Words matter. Being a person who speaks in a civil tone and in a civil manner is a virtue. Practicing civility is a virtue. And so I want to say, for all those high-strung writers on both the political right and left, I would remind them that being civil is not a cop-out to trim one's convictions. Civility is not a wimp word. It's not. Being nice is not being a wimp. The American religious historian Martin Marty put it well when he said this: people who are civil often lack convictions, and people who have convictions often lack civility. What we need are people who have convicted civility. Convicted civility. Civility is not just a matter of good manners and pulling our punches. Civility and kindness does not mean passivity. It is instead a matter of showing fundamental respect and decency for the people we're engaging in public arena. In order to be persuasive, even with our firmly held convictions, we must resist the temptations to respond in an emotive fashion, but instead in ways that are winsome and appealing. We have no reason to be fearful or sullen or mean-spirited. But for the grace of God, we would be on the other side. Now, why do I emphasize this? Because I can give you illustrations, and I've been at the Ethics and Public Policy Center for 30 years and involved in a lot of dialogues with people on the cultural and political left and right. I could give you illustrations of people in the Christian community who are not taken seriously because of the tone of their voice, by their very words, in fact, even by their very body language. And the blood vessels are coming out of their neck. They're so angry and so mad. But I want to argue we have a duty to be respectful to those we disagree with in the public arena. It is quite simply the fact that it's the will of God that we not kill each other over our differences about what the will of God is. It's the will of God that we not kill each other over our differences about what the will of God is. Put simply, we must speak with confidence and tranquility, with kindness and gentleness, so that people will begin to say of us that we speak with a Galilean accent that sounds a lot like Jesus. We need to develop Galilean accents that sound a lot like Jesus. Now, in conclusion, I began by noting that we live in a time when many important commentators are saying we live in a time of great transition. I want to conclude by suggesting that this time of transition is really the very nature of our lives and our earthly existence. We are always living in a time of great transition. And so we are today. We have this tendency to see our era as the worst era in all of human history. Times may be growing dark, but times have been dark since the fall in the Garden of Eden. We are not and we will not be the losers in history. The arc of history is long, but we know with confidence how it ends. And so there is confidence in the midst of this transition. The central doctrines of the sovereignty of God and the providence of God over all life and over all of history should give us confidence that the principalities and powers of this age will not have the final word. And so let's continue to love our neighbors right where we are, in our workplaces, in our businesses, and all areas of life, and let's ride out this cultural moment in the full confidence that God is the sovereign Lord of history and that all of history is in his hands. Our task is to bless our neighbors, to cultivate shalom, to continue to remind people of the wonderful news of the gospel, and let me say parenthetically, especially since we will need to be poised to receive the wounded who will be the inevitable victims of our current cultural malaise and dysfunctions. They will be coming to our churches 10 years from now saying, I thought I had it right. And we need to be ready to receive them with the good news of the gospel. So let's continue doing all the good that we can, in the many ways that we can, confident in our strong faith and our loving and merciful God. Knowing this will keep us from panicking. It will keep us from screaming. It'll keep us from freaking out. It'll keep us from caving in to the pressures that surround us on every side. Knowing these theological doctrines of the providence and sovereignty of God will at least give us comfort that we know how the story ends. And so, we must continue to do our various duties faithfully while living in exile, fully aware and confident that the final consummation of history and true justice will come with the restoration of the entire universe to its original created glory. So then, let's continue to be faithful to do our duties even while in exile. Thank you very much.